Let me bring up one more thing before I'm done with this video. And that is one of the ways of misleading with statistics, if you go back to this paper that I gave you, that talks about how to create misleading statistics in 6 easy steps. The very first one is a very common way of misleading with statistics. And I don't know if you can read this very well, but it's do a survey or a sample and use the biased sample. They call it a biased sample population. I've never heard that. But the term that's important here is biased sample. Okay? What is a biased sample? Let me explain. This is a very important concept. A biased sample is simply, the definition is a sample which does not accurately reflect the population. So a biased sample is a sample which does not accurately reflect the population. Okay? So if you draw conclusions based upon the biased sample, the conclusions you draw are going to be misleading. They're not going to necessarily be true for the entire population. And the reason is because the sample doesn't reflect the population. Okay? Now, a biased sample, it does not necessarily mean that the person taking the sample is biased. Okay? They just maybe did a very bad job selecting people for the sample. If they do not randomly select people for their sample, if it's not random, then it will be a biased sample. It means that not all the values have the same chance of being in the sample as every other value. So the key thing is you want a randomly selected sample instead. Okay? But just because we call it a biased sample doesn't mean it's biased on the part of the person. Maybe the person has good intentions, but they do a bad job taking out the sample, and so it does not accurately reflect the population. Okay? But on the other hand, it could be that they pick for their sample exactly who they want in their sample. And so it is truly a bias on the part of the person. And so it could be meant to be biased. And in that sense, they are misleading you with their statistics. And in that way, someone could make a statistic say anything they wanted it to say just by sampling people who are going to prove their point of view. Take just those who prove their point of view and don't include any of the rest, and then you can make it say whatever you want it to say. Okay? Here is one way that a biased sample can occur. This is a very common way of getting a biased sample. This example here, it has nothing to do with my own political views necessarily. It's just a good example. This is a Fox News call-in poll, and it's with George Bush. Okay? And right now we are in Obama's second term. So this is about 4 years out of date, and we'll see. Maybe this video gets used 10 years from now. Then you'll know exactly how old this video is, won't you? So, okay. How did the president do? Well, 84% of the population say excellent, 4% says average, and 10% says poor. Okay? Now, besides the fact that these don't add up to 100%, which I'm not sure what that means. Maybe 2%, I don't know, are not included here. But just ignore that fact. Assume that they did add up to 100%. This is still a misleading statistic. And the reason for that is because it is a biased sample. Do you see why this is a biased sample? Can you see why? It's because this is a Fox News call-in poll. And if you know about Fox News, it's more conservative than other stations like CNN or other news media stations. And so the people that watch Fox News are going to be more conservative. So the sample is kind of biased towards the conservative side. And conservative people would have felt that George Bush is doing an excellent job. Okay? And so the sample does not represent the entire population. So if somebody said that I took some sample and they left it out, that it was a Fox News call-in poll, and said the president must be doing good, at least most people in the population think so, and they use these, that would be misleading. Okay? If you know that it's a Fox News poll, then we should just know that these are not going to necessarily reflect the entire population. This kind of sample is called a voluntary response sample, and it means that the respondents themselves decide whether to be included. Sometimes they call that a self-selection sample. So it means that people aren't randomly selected. It means that the people decide themselves to be in the sample. And usually people that have strong views one way or another decide to be in the sample, and then the middle part of the population never get involved. And so it does not necessarily, a voluntary response sample or a self-selection sample does not necessarily do a good job representing the entire population. It would be a biased sample. Let me give you another really interesting example, and then we'll end with this example. This is a true example here. The Literary Digest was a magazine near the beginning of the 19th century, or sorry, the 1900s, so the beginning of the 20th century. And what they did during the presidential elections, they would take huge surveys and they would predict who would win the election. Okay, and this particular year, the year, I'm not seeing the year on here, but I think it was the first year of the Roosevelt election. Okay, the Literary Digest sent out 10 million ballots. Okay, and so unbelievably large sample. Okay, and they received 2,376,000 responses. And they predicted that Landon would beat Roosevelt by a large margin. Okay? So they believed that Landon would win. I don't even know who Landon is. So obviously he did not win. Okay? So that's sampling error on their part. Their sample did not lead them to the right conclusion. Well, if you've heard of the Gallup poll, this is where the Gallup poll comes from. George Gallup, who is an actual individual and was not very well known at that point, he sampled only 50,000 voters, and he correctly predicted that Roosevelt would win the election. Okay? And he did it with only 50,000 voters. And in fact, this here is the percentage of votes that went to Roosevelt. And the Literary Digest said about 40%. The Gallup said about 56%, okay, and he actually received 61% of the votes, okay? And so Gallup actually concluded that Roosevelt would win, okay, and he was fairly close to the 61%, while the Literary Digest was way off, and their sample was huge, okay? And it's kind of a neat story because Gallup was ridiculed for his prediction because he only sampled 50,000 people, but the Literary Digest suffered a humiliating defeat and soon went out of business. And the Gallup poll is still continuing to this day. So he made a name for himself here by correctly predicting the election. The way that he did it is he had a randomly selected sample. Everybody in the United States had the same chance of being selected as everybody else. I think the Literary Digest had their survey was sent out to addresses And I think it was like people that had a vehicle and a telephone or something like that. If they owned a vehicle and or a telephone, then they got one of the ballots from the Literary Digest. And so it became like a self-selection sample, and only 2 million of them. So this was a voluntary response sample, and it did not represent the entire population. So George Gallup, with his randomly selected sample of 50,000, correctly predicted the election, while the huge sample here of the Literary Digest was way off. A very interesting example, and also some history of where the Gallup poll comes from. So remember, one way statistics can be misleading is by using a biased sample to draw conclusions about the entire population. So